So then the next, so they're stressors. So then the next element of the model are mediators, or you can also think of these as why some people with many stressors experience few health effects, and conversely, why some people who have relatively few life stressors experience significant health effects. And these refer to all of these various factors that may make people either more vulnerable or more resilient to the stressors they experience. So key resources or key mediators that are often considered in stress research. And here you see the influence both of Durkheim's earliest thinking as well as Selye's thinking. So because they, I think, are very much rooted in individual level resources or individual factors. So these include social resources like emotional support, being socially integrated, well embedded in communities. It could be a school community, a religious community, and so on, having these sort of strong ties, whatever those mean. The social resources also include material support or having the ability to get instrumental support, financial assistance, and so on when you need it. And this isn't studied so much anymore, but when social resource that was popular to there was a good deal of work done in the 80s was on social comparisons, or whether you're making downward versus upward comparisons. And generally what's found is that if you're the kind of person that makes downward comparisons, so in other words, oh, at least I'm not as bad off as that poor fool, you know, that this tends to be health protecting. Again, it's really kind of fallen out of fashion in the literature. And then psychological resources include things like mastery and self-esteem, where the extent to which you take a positive view of yourself and believe yourself to be competent and able to achieve what you wish to achieve. They include different coping orientations, or your tendency to cope with stressors either actively or passively. There's other strategies too, like collective coping, engaging collective coping efforts, engaging in passive coping efforts. Avoidant, I said passive, I mean avoidant. And then there are other new emerging areas of study right now. The idea of mattering to others is getting a lot of attention in this literature, and that this can be that this differentiates people in terms of how individuals respond to stress, seeing it as you know, something that you have to manage, not just for yourself but for all the people that you matter to, versus seeing this as something that you're experiencing very much on your own. So these are key mediators. And then health outcomes are the last element of the model. But unlike in Selye's earlier model, disability is really not considered to be the outcome according to these models. So really up until 5 years ago, disability, and I find this also highly problematic. Disability was described in various ways as a chronic stressor, that the experience of limitation, the experience of functional limitation, activity limitations, challenges in doing instrumental activities, that this was seen as stressful. More recently, kind of moving away from that kind of deficit understanding of disability, there's more work considering disability as a contextual factor or a status which differentiates people. And so this is how we can come to understand and identify differences associated with disability, leading to differences in outcomes. So to restate this, I've shown this, you know, like we can think of different aspects of what it means to have a disability at each point in the model. So, you know, in thinking about status group or affiliation or context, recognizing disability as a legal or policy category or as a social identity, it's a political identity. And it's, you know, it's an identity that may be based on physical, psychological, and intellectual disabilities or experiences. And then at the intermediary level, when we think about stressors, there's, you can take this sort of classic consideration of thinking about pain, chronic symptoms. But I think that, if we, from a starting point of thinking of disability more as a status category, this can shift our attention then to thinking about the daily hassles that you might experience because of a disability, like experiencing discrimination, prejudice events, stigma in various ways. And then from there, then recognize how this can lead to differences in health trajectories for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities in all matters of outcomes. One thing that has really not been contested from Selye's earlier work is the understanding that the impact of stressors on the body is non-specific. And interestingly, I'll say too, just before I move on, there's really nothing that, to my knowledge, that has been done in thinking about disability-related resources. And I think that that's a real limitation of the literature at this time, and it's something that I'd love to talk about more and think about more too. But so then in terms of recent trends, so one is that there has been more interest in modeling using data from a long period of time and understanding changes over time. And you really see this in kind of the popular media and the attention that's been paid recently to the impact of acute childhood events on adult health. But within the scientific literature on stress, there's also there's a new ability, but also significant interest in modeling stress over an extended period of time and across generations in families. Second, there's been more development and understanding contextual stressors. So this started in the early 2000s with more work looking at neighborhood characteristics and the effect of neighborhood characteristics on health, and has really been expanded from there, and thinking not just like, well, how does a recession affect our health? How did 9/11 affect our health? But also thinking about how these kinds of stressors are connected to other stressors that we may experience. And then there's also been further consideration of status-specific stressors. And so by that, I mean stressors that are only experienced by women or by race ethnic minorities or by people with disabilities, for example. Okay. So these are three important trends. And there is, however, also this kind of remaining question about how context matters and whether context influences one's exposure to stress or one's vulnerability to stressors, or to both. So I'm going to pause the slides here now. So if there are any questions, maybe I'll just stop the share for a minute, and then I would be very happy to address any questions posed in the Q&A. I'm not seeing it.
We have one question in the chat box, and the question is from attendee named Eric. I'm interested to know why BMI is used in healthcare.
Yeah, me too, Eric. That's a great question, and there's really not a great answer. That, I really don't know why BMI is used and why it's applied in the way it is. I can tell you that. So as I mentioned, like the BMI was originally something that was like the French ideal man, and then was incorporated in other countries. And Japan was the first country which said, like, this does not work for us at all, and it makes no sense as a health tool, and so did away with any kind of health screening, including or based on BMI. And we just are not there in the US. You know, instead, like, rather than doing away with the BMI entirely, there's been more focus over the past few decades on retooling the BMI to better address the population averages. And so this has been done in a few ways. One is retooling the BMI so that it would be relevant to women. What's it made for women's bodies? So that was like one of the first adaptations, is thinking about, well, what would an average BMI, or what should an average BMI be for women, and is that different than for men? But, you know, I think the Japanese context is really, really salient, because you know, recognizing that different races and different ethnicities have different body types. You know, that's not something that we've done at all in the United States. And I don't know that it's something that we're able to do. And then, you know, another important critique of the BMI is that it can't differentiate between muscle mass and fat mass in the body. So I don't know why I do not know why. I think that actually, if we were talking about stress and we were to say, well, you know, it was influenced by the tobacco lobby, that would make more sense, but that's not the case. So I don't know, unfortunately.
We have a question from Keisha Wyndham, and the question is it the prevailing view in the modern scientific study of stress research that at the onset of disability is inherently stressful for the person? Dr. Malachi Bishop of the University of Wisconsin at Madison says that the onset of disability is usually, but not necessarily, stressful, at least not for all people. In other words, if we seek to help people with disabilities respond to stress associated with disability or their lives in general, do we need to first understand whether the stimulus in question actually poses stress for them? It seems to me this should be done at the individual and experiential level. Thank you for this outstanding presentation.
Oh, well, this is such a great question that you pose. And so I love that you asked this, because I think that, you know, this is where you can really see certain biases coming through. And I think, like, initially some scholars felt that, you know, the onset of a chronic health condition would necessarily be stressful. And, you know, in fact, what some of the research that came out in the 1990s showed pretty clearly is that for many people, getting a diagnosis, or, you know, being able to organize symptoms, that in fact that's a huge relief. So, you know, maybe it's important to differentiate between diagnosis and having, you know, the onset of an impairment, that those aren't, you know, really the same thing. But you're absolutely right that there's considerable variation in the degree to which the onset of a disability is experienced as stressful. And absolutely, you know, I think that this then gets into how we think about disability socially and culturally as, you know, as something that is able to be, that's rooted in the degree to which we're able to adjust in our lives to health changes, which we all experience across our lives. So I think that's a really good question. And, you know, and then, so kind of continuing on that, one of the things that research that started in the 1990s that showed that, well, you know, there's a lot of variation in how people experience the onset of a health condition. It also showed that for those who, you know, experience, you know, mental distress or experience this as something highly stressful, that's really tends to be temporary. And so I think all of those are a good example of how, you know, when we take kind of disability as the starting point, it changes the way in which we orient ourselves to research.
We have another
Oh.
question from Carolyn. And the question is there any research to indicate if a person who is born with a disability experiences less or more stress than a person who acquires a disability? Or is it more dependent on the mediators and support a person has?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, again, that is a really, really good question. And I think it's really contextual and specific. So one of the things that I'm not, I'm going to often answer questions based on what in the literature I find most interesting. And so I hope that you all will bear with me with that. But one of the things that I think is important is, so, you know, for many people, what your early work experiences are in your late teens, early 20s, that's really important because it can place you on a very different trajectory that's going to affect your health over your whole life or over your whole working life, and then as you transition out of the workforce. So, and I think that that's a really good example to address your question, because what that research shows is when people are entering the workforce, young people entering the workforce who have a disability, what their trajectories look like can be so different. I mean, there's so much variation just based on the ability of an employer, the ability of the workplace, not just to accommodate disability, but to accommodate a worker in any way, to be a good place to work, to offer creative work, autonomous work, and all of these things that we know really matters. And so when you experience that early on in employment, it places you on a different trajectory, not just in terms of health, but also in terms of what your work life is going to look like over the course of your career. So I hope that that answers your question. Yes, there has been work done. I don't think that it is definitive about the best time in life to experience the onset of disability. But I think that it's helpful then in thinking about how, you know, certain institutions or certain contexts that we experience throughout our lives, like how school matters, how work matters, and so on, and thinking about how that affects us over time. I hope that answered your question.
This question is from Jamie.
Okay.
Have you done research around adverse childhood experiences, also referred to as ACEs, ACE?
Mm-hmm.
Have you done research around adverse childhood experiences and the intersectionality with disabilities?
I have not studied adverse childhood events myself, and I'm less familiar. So my own research has typically focused on people around midlife and into later life. And so overall, I'll be honest that I'm less familiar with the early childhood stress literature than I am on the literature and keeping up with the literature on midlife and later life, and also like kind of early adulthood. So I don't know, kind of, I don't feel like I can paint an overall picture of what that literature looks like. I do know that currently there's interest in the experience of, this is just one category of ACE, but there's interest in abuse, the experience of abuse by young people, by children with disabilities, and how that affects health and functioning over the life course.
Those are all the questions we have at the moment.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead then and move into part 2. These were great questions. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm not where I'm not where I'm supposed to be. I should have shared this. Okay, so now based on, here we go, from, oh, here we are. Okay.
We can see we can see the screen.
Okay, so now I'd like to move into talking a little bit more about how stress research has responded to the pandemic. So again, as I just said before our Q&A break, we have, we can think about disability at all levels of the stress process. And I mention this because I've been really interested in, as I was saying to Walt at the beginning of our time together, I'm a new adapter of Twitter, and I know this isn't a great time to do that, but since the start of the pandemic, I was a new adapter of Twitter, and it has been very interesting to me to read the kinds of things that people are writing about, not just experiencing the pandemic, but also how it has made certain kind of chronic stressors that are disproportionately experienced by people with disabilities more difficult. So talk a little bit about that more too in a minute. So cue up my second cup of tea. Okay. So when we think about the pandemic, and again, when we think about COVID-19, this is a global pandemic. We have this macro level event that has had all kinds of effects. You can't even really, I'll say for me as a stress researcher for a long time, I couldn't even think about this like academically. But we have this shared trauma, the shared experience that's affecting all sorts of institutions that we're tied to. It's affecting education, it's affecting work. I mean, that we have this term, the Great Resignation now. That just shows how significantly the work effects have been. It's affecting the family, it's affecting home life, it's affecting relationships, personal relationships, friendships, and certainly it's affecting individuals too, in the way we've gone about our life over the past nearly 3 years now. So with that in mind, thinking about all of the ways that the pandemic has been stressful, we can kind of organize our thinking into 3 categories. When we think about what have been the most acute effects, what has been most stressful about the pandemic, especially thinking early on what it meant to have the virus early on in the pandemic, that experiencing the virus itself. So, we can think of this both as a non-event or the thing that we fear will happen, and as an event, that when the thing we feared happens. When I was supposed to speak for this seminar series in September, and I was out with COVID, and unfortunately I experienced both of those things, experiencing the event itself, and also coming to terms with how much I had wanted to avoid it up until then. So we have the virus itself, profoundly stressful. We have the transformation of the healthcare system that has accompanied the virus and the pandemic, and then also the experience of quarantine and various mitigation measures, which have varied significantly in different contexts. So just to unpack each of these 3 points, and what they mean for people with disabilities. So first, and I have you'll have to excuse me just for the sake of providing you with a cleaner presentation. I haven't included citations for many of the points that I make in this point, but I have a pretty, I've put together a reference list for anyone that's interested that I'm happy to provide, along with some readings that these slides are based on, that also include these citations. So I apologize that this isn't cited. I thought it would be it would make it easier to follow along and to have a cleaner presentation. But okay, so thinking about having the virus itself. So people who have physical, intellectual, and developmental disabilities have contracted the virus, have contracted COVID-19, and have died at higher rates than people who are not currently disabled. And so across disability type research has also shown that people with disabilities as a group are more likely to experience more severe complications. And the estimates that I've seen have varied pretty wildly from like, 1 time more likely to 3 times more likely, or 2 times more likely to 3 times more likely. There's some variation, but the point is that it is, if you think of the virus as a health threat, it's a greater health threat to people with disabilities as a group. Okay. But it has also, been challenging when experiencing or facing this health threat to not have the kinds of healthcare resources that are so needed. And there are a lot of really dramatic examples of this, but just to kind of to make some basic points about what this has meant. So first is that people with disabilities have either gone without or with less routine medical care over the past nearly 3 years. They've disproportionately borne the brunt of widespread healthcare service disruptions during this period, as more and more healthcare resources were shifted to acute care from care for people with chronic health conditions. But it is also the case that many people with disabilities have been placed at increased risk for COVID-19 infection due to the need for routine medical care or assistance, because as we know, many conditions are not well managed via telehealth. But then also there have been additional health complications that have been linked to having appointments canceled or needing to skip appointments, having delays in getting medication refilled, and so on. So healthcare resources and shifts in healthcare resources throughout the pandemic period have also had significant effects for many people with disabilities. So that's point 2. And then third, when we think about what quarantine has meant for people with disabilities, one analysis that I recently read talked about how, so when I say quarantine measures here in the slide, quarantine measures, I mean state regulations and the effects that they've had on different groups. And maybe you've seen some of the reports about differences in childcare for men and women during the pandemic. That's something that I, as a woman, have been, as a mother, have been, as a parent, have been interested in. But there's also science. There's social research that has come out to show that people with disabilities have disproportionately been affected in terms of losing their jobs, seeing declines in finance, troubles in personal relationships, and in social relationships in terms of social embeddedness. And so people with disabilities have both reported greater social isolation since the start of the pandemic compared to people without disabilities, but are also more likely to live in congregate living settings or accommodations that place them at greater risk because they're unable to follow social distancing guidelines. So, and I say here to this point, so the American Association of Health and Disability does a national survey, and in 2020 it found that so 2020 at the onset and the height, of the pre-vaccine era, they found that social distancing was impossible for more than half of those with disabilities who they surveyed, which was really a concerning finding. So the point that we can take from this is that the pandemic has influenced multiple domains of life. You could say all domains of life, and that it has done this disproportionately for people with disabilities. So on your screen now, I have, this is from a study, a co-authored study that came out last year, and the lead author and the head of this, the head of the data collection, is a UK graduate who is now an associate professor at Utah State. Gabrielle Shishikate. But so this was a survey in the Intermountain West. I'm going to talk more about the survey in a minute, but I just want to show you first, you know, in thinking about this is what's in the literature, and then I'll talk about my own research, but about the kinds of differences between people with disabilities and people without. There is an additional ability with this data to break down the people with disabilities category, which is, you know, includes a very diverse group of people. There is the ability to break that down by disability type, including the physical, psychological, or intellectual or developmental disabilities. But the reason that I didn't do that for my presentation is that in the data, it's very common for people to, and in life, and in the population, it's very common for people to have overlapping categories of disability or multiple disabilities. And so, you know, when we tease out primary disabling category or disabling condition, it kind of loses people that and is imposing differences that might actually not be all that meaningful. So I have everything here. So where we're comparing people with disabilities to people who are not currently disabled at the time of the study. And as we look across these different domains, you can see a clear pattern of difference. You know, not where people with disabilities are disadvantaged compared to people without disabilities. So in the employment domain, for example, and these questions that were asked were based on earlier work that I did on the recession that then were adapted to the pandemic context really in real time as the pandemic was happening. But so thinking about, you know, the kinds of experiences that are commonly linked to the pandemic, like losing your job, taking a pay cut, not getting a raise, not getting a bonus, not knowing if your employment situation is going to continue, having work precarity in that regard, having more to do despite these cuts, losing your job, just having problems otherwise defined, having to work even though you don't want to, and having to work despite feeling like you might get sick. These are all things that people with disabilities experience significantly more than people without. And then this, of course, I think spilled in like work-life balance became really non-existent, especially for those of us who were working at home in those early days. But you see this sort of spilling into household management in terms of problems paying rent or mortgage, problems paying for gas, electricity, or heat, experiencing delays or difficulties when applying for government financial assistance programs, not having enough food to eat due to limited financial resources, or not having enough food to eat because you aren't able to access your normal food sources anymore. And then the last category in terms of household that we studied was having to go to work despite being in poor health because your family depends on your salary. So all of those, each one of those items significantly greater for people with disabilities compared to people without. And then continuing, you know, thinking about personal and social relationships, we also observed significant differences in having a relationship end, a marital or significant other relationship end, or and on the other hand, staying in an unwanted relationship due to quarantine or stay in place orders. And then in terms of social life, differences associated with increased social isolation, decreased ability to maintain the same lifestyle, and decreased work-life balance due to work or homeschooling or other responsibilities. So multiple domains of life, and across these domains, we do see differences between people with and without disabilities. So I want to talk to you all a little bit more about what this has meant in terms of employment experiences. And again, as I said, because I think that it can often be helpful to take a broader trend and then apply it to a specific domain of our life. I hope that this will be helpful to you in kind of contextualizing these differences more. So the data that I'm going to use so it's not national data, it's from an Intermountain West survey that was done. And, I'll say that there are pros and cons of using national data versus using regional or community level data. I think a pro, the biggest pro of using national data is when it's nationally representative. We don't have these lingering questions about whether there's something unique about that other context that is explaining the results we see. But on the other hand, and I think that this is really a bigger advantage often for community surveys, is that they typically include much more robust stress inventories. So stress researchers often are working in communities or in region limited surveys. So you have much more diverse measures, but on the other hand, you have sort of less diversity of generalizability. So, I do want to say that. So this is a study that was in the Intermountain West. I don't think that anything we're going to see is going to seem especially unusual. And, in fact, we might think about ways that it could be more or less relevant in other contexts. This survey was done toward the beginning, it seems like toward the beginning now, so in July of 2020, and it included 2,043 respondents, of which roughly half, or 1,020 respondents, had some form of disability that they reported in the screener. So the focus that my focus is going to be on the pandemic's workplace effects, as I said. And the reason that I want to do this is because work has become so much more precarious since the start of the pandemic, in terms of increased risk, but also in the demands that have been placed on many people in the work context. But, while this shows differences, it also shows that pre-existing inequalities in employment have had a spillover effect into the pandemic period. So this highlights, as I said, like both these pre-existing biases and what the biases that are pre-existing inequalities, and the biases reinforcing them. So we've seen that these trends are also more pronounced among people with disabilities. There has been a disproportionate exodus of people with disabilities from the workplace since the start of the pandemic. And this is another area that I think is ripe for better and more research, is how the Great Resignation has really, has had profound effects on the disabled community and for people with disabilities. And then, as I said before, we have seen these differences in quarantine and mitigation effects. And a number of studies have shown that the employment costs of mitigation effects have been especially burdensome for people with disabilities. And so then, perhaps not surprisingly, in the context of pandemic-related stress, people with disabilities have experienced more psychological distress. And I prefer to focus on psychological distress in research rather than whether people meet the criteria for a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, because often these sort of sub-syndromal levels of distress, are really significant. Just because you don't meet the criteria for major depression, if you see a clear spike in these symptoms, that is in itself an important thing to know. So when I'm talking about psychological distress, so I'm talking about depression and anxiety both. or so greater depression and anxiety, unless I say so otherwise. Okay.